Hi there. Welcome to Creation Station Monthly. This is our monthly show, where we talk about one interesting topic with two strangers who have never met until we just started this show. Today, it's going to be about politics. Trust me, it's going to be fun. It's not what you're thinking. I know we're a tech show. Why are we talking about politics? Just wait. I have two great guests, Kimberly Adams from a million different things out there for Marketplace and C-SPAN and everything, and Dr. Angela Nichols from FAU. Welcome to you both for the show today.
Thank you.
Dr. Angela, fill us in. Give us your nutshell biography about who you are and what you do.
Oh, wow. Okay. So the elevator speech, I am a tenured associate professor at Florida Atlantic University. My research broadly focuses on human rights and conflict. My research currently focuses on women's experiences and rebel movements and peace processes. And I've been doing a lot of field work in Colombia lately.
Kimberly, go.
Hi, so I'm Kimberly. I work at the Public Radio Business and Economy Program Marketplace, where I'm the senior Washington correspondent. And I also co-host our podcast, Make Me Smart, with Kai Risdahl, who everybody knows and loves. I also, under our parent company, American Public Media, host a mental health show called Call to Mind, where we focus on a variety of mental health issues and send those shows out to stations. And then on the weekends, because why be boring, I host Washington Journal on C-SPAN.
Yeah, just two people here who know quite a few things about what we're about to talk about here. So, Angela, I'm going to start you off, Angela, and then if you, Kimberly, just follow up as you want to there. What I want to know is, how did you get first interested in politics and the idea of not the public side of politics, like I want to be a Democrat, I want to be a Republican running for office, but you're deep into the background stuff about the why and how it works. Tell us about that.
Okay.
Were you a little kid doing this and organizing people in the neighborhood?
Yeah, that story sort of starts a little more traditionally with political engagement, because as a young adult, as an adolescent and teenager in high school, I was very involved in local politics. I grew up in North Texas, and I was involved in campaigning for Ann Richards and some other campaigns when I was young in the 90s. And so I sort of developed a love for engagement. I felt like a very strong calling to civic duty. And I felt like it was important to try to get other young people engaged. So I, worked on these campaigns, got involved, and I joined the Army, actually. I spent 5 years in the military as a Serbian and Croatian linguist. And during that time, I really learned a lot more about the world than I knew as a green young teenager just running around campaigning. And that time sort of, before college, because then after those 5 years, I went to Penn State and then the University of North Texas. And then, that time in the military and that time working on campaigns sort of shaped my experience as a college student that I think is a little bit different from other college students that go into maybe political science.
I went through a variety of things when I was a kid that I wanted to be when I grew up. And at one point, I did want to be a politician because I thought that would be a great way to, help people. And then I met some politicians as a child, and I was like, you know what? No, this is not for me. And I decided instead, after a couple more permutations, that I wanted to go into journalism. And I started with my first internship when I was 16 years old. And I realized pretty quickly, working in newsrooms, that a lot of the problems we have in society stem from people not having full information or not having good information, and especially underrepresented communities, people of color, low income people, people in rural areas who don't have the same kind of access to information. It harms them. It harms them economically, it harms them emotionally, and it harms their political power. And so I wanted to do something about it. I also, when I was very young, I wanted adventure in my life. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And so I did an internship in London when I was in college. And then after I graduated from college, the University of Missouri, Columbia, I went to the American University in Cairo and worked as a freelancer in Cairo while I was in school for a while in the lead up, actually, to the Arab Spring. I wasn't there for the Arab Spring. I was back in the United States working at NPR at the time. But then after the Arab Spring, I went back in 2012 to cover the aftermath and then the coup and the rise of the dictatorship and then the suppression of the attempts at democracy. And then Egypt decided they weren't a fan of foreign journalists anymore and made my life very difficult. And that was around the time that Marketplace was like, hey, you want to come back to Washington and cover economics? And I was like, sure. And I was like, this is going to be so much easier to cover a nice, stable democracy, and I can cover the elections, and there's not going to be any violence or any threat. And that was in 2015. And yeah, it's been great. It's been great.
Now, how does that compare, Angela, with what you just said earlier, going down into Colombia and doing that sort of stuff down there with them? How does that fit in with your political, your idea of how politics is supposed to be handled for the individual person and stuff like that? Because you said you started going and then you were starting into, especially with the stuff there in Colombia.
Yeah, so that's just sort of a function of where the research has taken me. I would say that if you want to make a comparison, I think the main thing I feel when I come home from Colombia oftentimes is a lot of gratitude for the things we take for granted often in our lives. When I'm there, cold showers are the regular and things like that. So there's just small little luxuries in life that we tend to sort of take for granted that I feel like I really appreciate when I'm back home after a trip. But when it comes to politics, I would actually say that I find Colombians more deeply engaged than I do most or the average American. The political process, the peace process, the violence in Colombia, it's all very salient, I would say, with most people. It's on the TV all the time. It's in the universities. It's part of their curriculum now, the peace process. The peace agreement was signed in 2016. So I would actually say that I feel as though a lot of the folks there are more engaged and aware of what's relevant and pertinent to their own lives than I unfortunately see a lot of Americans thinking about here, and my students especially, to be honest.
And I think that says a lot about American culture and how our political system is set up. There are enough people who feel sufficiently insulated from the outcomes of policy changes that they think they don't have to care.
Absolutely.
Which means that you think that no matter who's in power, it's not going to meaningfully change your day-to-day lived experience. Whether or not that's true, and as we learned in the pandemic, it really does matter who's sitting in these offices and who's sitting in these chairs and who's sitting in these rooms where decisions are being made to your day-to-day life. And one thing that I've been covering quite a bit at Marketplace is that whoever wins in November, both in the presidential race and in Congress, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is going to be expiring, or many provisions of it are going to be expiring at the end of 2025. That was a huge overhaul to our tax system and affected how much money a lot of people pay in taxes. The vast majority of Americans saw a change. So whoever is sitting in Congress and in the White House at the end of 2025 will literally make a meaningful difference to how much money you make and how much money you keep. But some people are just like, oh, it doesn't matter. Politics, you can't change anything, but you can.
I always talk about, I also help and work for the elections here in Broward. And I always say, they wouldn't be trying to stop you from voting if it didn't matter.
Well, and especially in the local elections, because even if there are some granules of truth to the difficulty in changing things at a federal level, and I'm not going to lie, it's very hard. It is much easier to change things at a local level. And that is why the people who want things to stay the same or get worse, depending on who you're asking, it behooves them to keep people disinterested at the local level in particular.
Absolutely. It's so disappointing that negative campaigning and negative politicking really does work. It's effective for the reasons they want it to be effective. It's often what I have to sort of explain to my students, the system isn't really broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to work. And if you want it to change, you need to get involved. You need to get engaged. You need to think about local politics because, like you said, it takes a long time to change anything at the much higher levels. And we oftentimes are very short-sighted. I think our shadow of the future that we tend to pay attention to, we, the collective, we, is a lot shorter than it ought to be.
And do you think it's the same politics, Colombia, Egypt, et cetera? I mean, is it the same negative campaigning wins or I'm not saying wins. It seems to be more influential. How's that?
I think what I saw in Egypt was the consequences of a extremely disengaged elite. So the revolution was a lot of young people, a lot of educated people, a lot of people who skewed higher income, who were in the streets protesting, very plugged in with Western groups, media organizations, people who had traveled, who had a sense of the world and wanted something different in Egypt. But then when it came time, when they actually were successful and they overthrew the dictatorship, they called for elections. But what many of them didn't realize is that while they were traveling and living their lives of comfort and ease and had the option to go and protest in the streets, the vast majority of Egyptians had been suffering and struggling, and they knew how to function under the old system, and they had found a way to make it work, and they didn't know how to function under this new system. And so prior to the revolution, the only people who would help them when the government was not providing social services, when the government wasn't providing food assistance, when the government wasn't providing healthcare to the extent that it was needed, who was providing it? Religious groups. And so then when those same religious groups came back and said, vote for us, they were like, sure, because you've been there. These kids protesting in the streets were never there for us. And so then when the Muslim Brotherhood won a free and fair election, they couldn't deal because it didn't match up with their own ideals. And I actually think we saw something quite similar in the United States in 2016. Donald Trump appealed to a large number of people who felt completely disconnected from the liberal elites running media, running government, and voted with intention. They said, we want something different. And what was the reaction of the people in established places? Oh, they just didn't know any better. They don't realize what Trump is going to do. They're not educated enough. Surely if we give them enough information about Trump, they won't support him anymore. And what did that do? It just made people feel talked down to. It was condescending. It was dismissive. You're telling people who are deeply religiously conservative that their views on abortion shouldn't allow them to dictate how they choose to vote, and dismissing people's legitimate concerns. And all that did was entrench the established parties. In Egypt, they got so upset about it that they literally overturned a democratically elected government and now are back into a dictatorship. Here in the United States, we have deepening political polarization, and who knows how it's going to turn out.
Well, and this isn't just Egypt or a few other places. This is a worldwide phenomenon. We're seeing a lot of swings around the world, a lot of protectionism, a lot of radicalization, a lot of these sorts of issues. But in Colombia specifically, it's sort of different from Egypt because Petro is the leftist president, the first ever elected since the period, they've all been assassinated, basically, if they ever had a legitimate chance of winning prior to election. He's been in power for a couple of years now. In Colombia, you're limited to one term, so he only has a couple left. Incredibly contentious. But in this case, a lot of the time, the FARC the ELN, a lot of the folks that are members of the armed groups that fight the government in Colombia and participate in a lot of the protests and things in the streets are Union Patriotica or these leftist armed groups, which tend to be more from the campesinos or the poor people from the countryside. And so rather than being the more established or entrenched elite, in this case, you see the pressure coming from the campesinos or the people who feel as though they are more politically disenfranchised, and that they actually, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of Marquetalia, which is the event in Colombia that created the FARC, which is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia that fought the 52-year-long civil war with the government. And that was the event where the government actually engaged in a massacre, a massive repression of a part of a state where there was a bunch of campesinos who had formed their own force. And so from that time period, there's been this tension between the government and the rest of the country, a lot of folks in the country that feel disenfranchised or unrepresented because Colombia is still a country that is very much difficult to navigate, difficult to travel across the terrain. It was just after the signing of the peace agreement that people were actually able to travel to various parts of the country because of the way the conflict had been. And so I think we see a lot of people rising up or pushing against their government, and that who's arguing with the government or who's pressuring the government tends to depend on who's in control of the government, right? And so in Colombia, for 60 years, it was the right-wing government, and so you see the pressure coming from the more left-wing part of the society. And
2024 is the year of elections. We have more than half the planet going to the polls this year to do all these things. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we're doing this show.
Mexico is up very soon, July, or is it June 2nd?
Yeah, India's already started. India has a very long election season.
Yeah, it's the largest democracy on the planet. It's amazing how they do the logistics of having that many people voting.
Yeah. I saw a thing where they're airdropping certain poll workers in to handle some of the most remote precincts. Is craziness. But I want to get one technology question in here for you both, because it sounds like it's a lot of, we need to make sure people have good, clean information to be able to make their own decisions, however they feel. And we have this new technology out there that could be used for good. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be used that way, especially this year. What do you two think is one of the best technologies that could be used to help people understand politics and help them understand the actual situations and what's going on?
So I'm actually an AI optimist, despite some of the deep fears I have about how this technology can and is being used. But I think we can just go back to, yes, this is us talking about this on Decoding Democracy with the host of Marketplace Tech, Lily Jamali. We were talking about the elections in India and specifically how AI is playing out there, because yes, it's being used for misinformation and disinformation, as in information that's being intentionally shared when it's wrong and information that is being intentionally shared knowing that it's wrong. And that's sort of the difference there. But some people are doing that. They're making the deep fakes. I actually know even a journalist who years ago was the subject of a horrible deep fake of where they made porn of her because they didn't like the kind of journalism that she was doing, and she got death threats. It was a terrible situation for her. And so it can be incredibly dangerous. However, in India, you have hundreds of different languages where people need information, and AI is allowing candidates to share their message across communities that they may not otherwise be able to do that. And here in the United States, I think that that's actually an opportunity for candidates and organizations to share their messages, to share their warnings, to share their details about polling places and things like that, and where to get good information in different languages, in authoritative voices. Is it open for abuse? Sure, but it could also expand access. And I think about some of the stories that I've done at Marketplace, and they're only available to English speaking audiences. And it might be nice to share that information with other communities in their own language and make that more accessible. But then how am I going to fact check it and make sure that it's being done well, especially with the hallucinations and the bad data that's coming out? I'm hopeful. I'm also really hopeful with AI and healthcare and some of the advances that are being made in that field. And so everybody thought the internet was going to destroy the world. People thought the printing press was going to destroy the world. The invention of the tractor literally changed the employment for the vast majority of the human population and entered and opened the industrial age. And somehow humanity survived. And knock on wood, we're going to figure this out too.
Yeah, we will. I have faith about that. Angela, what's going on with technology in you, especially as you're trying to teach and bridge those gaps?
Well, I mean, I have to agree with Kimberly that I think that, like all things, we just have to sort of figure it out. We need to give students, and we all need good tools to sort of know how to manage this and understand it and identify what's helpful and not. So I think that's useful to have open conversations with my students about those sorts of things. And then also for me, it sort of changed the way that I test my students in the classroom, I guess. I make them write by hand in the classroom sometimes now, which I had kind of gotten away from because people feel more comfortable on their computers or doing it from home. But now that it's so easy just to have, something else generate your essay, and I don't necessarily want to spend endless hours checking their essays. So I found new and interesting ways to engage them. So I think that we just all have to sort of be flexible and fluid and adapt to the ever-changing world that we live in.
So I'm going to start with you, Angela, first. One of the questions we always ask is, you guys have both been very successful. You're high up in your fields and you've had a lot of success. What's one of the things that you failed at that you were able to learn from to grow and build something new?
Failed at. Okay. Well, let's see. I mean, honestly, I guess I could talk about my time in the military because I wasn't that good of a linguist. I really wasn't. I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and learned Serbian and Croatian. I was good at my SIGINT in job with my headphones on, listening and translating. But I really wasn't a very talented or gifted linguist. So sort of for the first time in my life, I had always been, the best student, teacher's pet, student council president. I actually created the student council at my high school, all these sorts of things. And then I go to the military, I'm at language school, and I might have been the worst student in my class, So I think that was really, really challenging for me. I guess we can call that a failure. I finished my 5 years of service and went on to college. I didn't, stick with it. I probably could have, but I definitely felt like that was something that I wasn't really sailing through with ease so much. I was a really good soldier, but not a very talented linguist.
I did my 4 years in the Marine Corps, so I get that feeling of, you get in, you do your time, and this just isn't a good fit for the future. Yeah.
It was a great experience. I mean, I joined in 1999 and the conflict in Kosovo was happening, everything in Serbia and Croatia had happened in 93 to 95. The ICTY, the International Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia, was sort of picking up. And so it really influenced my studies and sort of drew me toward transitional justice, human rights, conflict, got me interested in these international things, and whereas I had previously been very focused on domestic politics. So I'm grateful for the experience. It shaped everything I've done since, but not necessarily in the way that I thought it would.
I wasn't a very good producer, so there are a couple of different pathways to getting to where I am in journalism. And they're changing all the time, which makes it really challenging to talk to younger journalists about how to have a career in this field right now. And I can talk about that later if you want. But when I came up, the path to becoming a foreign correspondent, like I wanted to, was to work in a local newsroom, then work in a bigger local newsroom, then work in a bigger local newsroom, then get to the networks, and then you can get sent abroad. But what I learned pretty quickly was that was not a pathway that was accessible to many women and certainly not many people of color. That was the pathway historically for white men to become foreign correspondents. And after sort of paying my dues and doing all the things that I thought I was supposed to do, I kept running into these barriers that didn't seem to align with the experience that I had that I thought would transfer. And it got really frustrating. And so I tried a different path, which I had seen a couple of other people do, which is that I tried to I did an internship at NPR, and then I became a production assistant, and then I became an assistant producer. And then I was a producer on the Washington desk and just produce. And I wasn't very good at it. But there were a lot of people who saw in me a lot of energy and that I tried really hard. But it's a kind of job, it's a support job that is incredibly detail oriented. It's very much big picture thinking. And what I realized over time is that I'm a lot better talking to people and listening to people and kind of pulling out information and creating narratives. But I remember when I was working at NPR as a producer on Weekend Edition, and they wanted to train me to direct the show, which was one of the things that producers did, which is that you choose the musical breaks between the different stories, you time out the show, and you give cues to the director, to the engineer, and to the host, and you tell them when to go. And I was terrible at it. I mean, terrible at it, to the point that they trained me for months and then they were just like, you know what? No, just no. And I was like, good job, everybody. Let's not do this anymore. And actually, when I worked in local news, I tried to be, they wanted me to be, I used to work in local TV news when I was in college, and they had me hosting. And I didn't like that either, because I didn't do a good job at it. I was terrible at reading from the teleprompter and tossing off and looking at the right camera at the right time. And I was so bad at it. And I actually didn't want, when I came to Marketplace and they said, hey, you should try training to host, I was like, no, I can't do it. I'm terrible at it. But what I realized I was bad at was the technical aspects of it. And I was just nervous. So on the production side, that was just not a good skill fit for me and what I like to do and what I do naturally. And on the hosting thing, I realized it was much easier for me to host on the radio when I'm sitting in a booth and I don't have to look at anybody. And it's just me and a microphone and I don't have to see anyone's reaction. That's much easier and more comfortable than sitting on a TV set with a ton of makeup and having to look in the right place. And now that I'm doing it for C-SPAN, they trained me completely differently, and there's only one camera to look at. So that helps.
And Angela, I think Kimberly just answered my question. My second question here was about how did you change how you express yourself in this field? What happened for you that you've changed? How did you get to be a professor of politics? How did that change from the army to that?
Well, I had an amazing professor at Penn State named Doug Lemke. He studies regional agreements. And he really planted a seed. You know, I was young, 22, 23, 24. I can't remember. It was a long time ago, right? I had a small baby. I was living in Pennsylvania and I was on the way. I thought I was going to go to law school and then become a politician, man. Like, that was my path. And he sat me down one day and said, you know, you ask really interesting questions, Angela. There's just something about the questions you ask and the things you want to investigate that can't be taught. And so I really think you should consider a different sort of career choice. Why do you want to be a lawyer? And things, my life changed a little bit. I got divorced. I moved back home, and that little seed started to grow. And I thought, maybe I should go to grad school. So I called up a few people and took the GRE and got a good scholarship to the University of North Texas. And here I am. I've been at FAU a decade now. I'm working on my second book, and I'm very happy. I found a place to be able to, talk to young people. I think I finally settled on my make a difference is in the classroom on kind of a daily basis. And then my hopefully bigger make a difference will be that maybe a lot of people will read this book about women's engagement in Colombia. And talking about accessibility, you made me think about something earlier, Kimberly, because for me, the projects I'm working on right now, it's incredibly important that things are also available in Spanish. And so that's going to be difficult for me moving forward because that's going to be part of my book deal. If I publish with you, then that means it has to also be in Spanish, at least online, because I don't want to be telling stories about people and they'll not be able to access that material. And again, AI sometimes can translate things pretty good for us, but there are some cases where the nuances are really important and AI can't really, our automatic translators don't do a great job. For instance, we're working on a Truth Commission translation project right now at the university. The Truth Commission in Colombia published thousands of documents after their 3 years of investigation, and only about 80 pages of it is available in English. And so I have a team here at the University of mostly Colombians or Colombian American students who are helping me to try to translate the documents to make them more widely available.
That is one of the things about here in South Florida. Just it seems like everybody should be living in a bilingual household.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on something that you said that really struck me, which is you called it your make a difference, and what your make a difference is in your career and what your make a difference is for the future. And I think that's such an interesting way to phrase it, because sometimes I get very overwhelmed with sort of the things I see going on versus my capacity to cover them and what I want to do as a journalist and what I think needs to be done in our industry versus what I humanly as an individual person can do. And I think what you just said is so important. You have to identify what your make a difference is. And there was a point in my career as a foreign correspondent when I realized I was never going to get good enough at speaking Arabic or at speaking any other language to do a better job covering stories in these countries than the fixers I was hiring and the translators I was hiring. Because the model at the time was if you were an American or a European, you can drop into wherever you want in the world, and your Americanness, which really was code for whiteness and outsiderness, was enough to give you authority to talk about what was going on. And to the great frustration of experienced journalists who were being paid significantly less to effectively do all the legwork. And so there came a point, especially towards the end of my time in Egypt, when I started training my fixers and translators to do the work that I was doing. So when I ended up leaving Egypt, I didn't give my clients, my freelance clients, to other foreign journalists. I gave them to my fixers because they could do the work. And what I'm seeing now is more and more news organizations, they're not sending their own people with no experience in the region to go just because they're a good journalist. They're looking for people who have some sort of connection to the region, who actually have the language skills. You don't really see so much new foreign correspondents being sent to places where they can't even speak the language, which used to be par for the course, And so my make a difference was that I can stop perpetuating this very colonialist model of journalism, right? And yes, Rest of the World is an amazing site. Let the people speak for themselves. My make a difference here in Washington, I kind of had this point a couple of years ago where I'd been applying for different opportunities in and outside of marketplace for bigger jobs, and they just weren't working out. And I came to the point where I was like, what am I exactly striving for? You know, I don't actually need to be a talking head on cable news. I don't need to be the host of the biggest show, because the work I'm doing now is fulfilling. I like it and it's making a difference. And so maybe I'm better served making my make a difference to do a good job at what I'm doing and help the next generation of journalists, particularly those from underrepresented groups, figure out how to navigate so they can do all the things that maybe had I not had so many barriers because I was a woman, because I was a woman of color, because I didn't have any connections in media, maybe my make a difference now is better served at clearing those pathways for other people.
Absolutely. I feel similarly, Kimberly. You know, FAU is a great school. We're getting our R1 status next year. But, you know, like everyone, you know, you want the dream job, you want the top program, this top state school or something like that. But I've had similar reflections, you know. I work with great colleagues. I can do the research I want to do. I have, you know, I think we place these limitations on ourselves when we think about prestige, and you don't need the prestige to do the good work. You just have to do the good work.
Yeah.
And recognizing when it's enough, I think, has been so powerful for me. Because one day I woke up and I was like, you know what? This is enough. It's enough for me. And now I can focus on what I want to do for everybody else.
Yeah, and hopefully you have a whole network of students and mentors and mentees and colleagues all over, you know, like I do now. I just had a student defend their dissertation at University of Arizona and Rutgers and all these lovely places. And I'm just so proud of all of my students and the amazing things they're doing for the world.
Yeah, whenever I'm out doing the school visits and career day stuff, I'm always like, what do you want to change? It's not what you want to be. It's what do you want to change? And then figure out how you're going to make that happen with whatever career you want. So both of you have already made a career of this. We've established this. Telling somebody else, though, in politics, in this idea of just being interested in the intricacies of how decisions get made, you know, in the room where it happens, etc. How can someone, or what do you think is someone's career path who's not going to make it a career? They're just interested in this. They're just like, I want to know what's going on. What's the best path for them? If they're just like, okay, you know, I really want to be a physicist. I'm going to be an astronaut, but I still want to pay attention to politics. I still want to pay attention to these things. You're going to get there someday, Kimberly.
I am going to be an astronaut. I believe I'm going to retire on the moon. I have faith.
Man.
Go to meetings. There are so many public meetings, city council, school board, insurance commission advisory meetings, transportation board. There are so many public meetings going on in your community that are legally required to be open to the public, and nobody shows up. And very few people know what's going on. And I imagine folks in Florida and California right now really wish they'd been paying attention to what was going on at those insurance advisory meetings over the last decade or two, because now they're facing unaffordable home insurance bills and making it impossible to sell their own homes. There are so many things happening in communities that very few people are paying attention to, and everyone's willing to gripe on next door about, you know, crime in the city, and the potholes, but who's showing up to the neighborhood advisory meetings? And, you know, you see all the viral videos about people being weird and yelling at each other in the streets, but there are forums where you can actually do something. And so you can be a physicist, and if you're a physicist testifying at your city council meeting about how climate change is going to affect the integrity of the asphalt in your community and why that means we need to be investing more in climate-friendly rebuilding of our communities, that's going to carry some weight. That's going to make a difference.
What do you think, Angela?
Absolutely. I think everything is politics. I think if you think that you aren't political, then you're confused about what is political. And sort of back to one of the first points I think Kimberly made, you must have a really insulated or some kind of, your life is such that you think that you don't have concerns, and that's concerning to me because that's not true, right? So I think that everything she said, folks need to get engaged. They think they need to run for office or focus on like the major presidential elections to do something important. But the most important things are happening right here in our neighborhood, right? I mean, or university politics. I go to faculty senate. I'm a senator. You got to be engaged.
You started your own when it didn't happen. You started your own student senate.
Oh, well, that was when I was in high school. But we also, we have all of those similar institutions at FAU, that we as faculty have to be engaged in. And sure, it takes up extra time. But if you're not going to those meetings once a month, you don't know what's happening.
Well, and we were just talking on Make Me Smart, I think on Friday, about a library in Idaho where the state legislature passed a law saying that anybody could complain about any book in a library, and they had to put it in an adults only section.
Oh no.
Accessible to children, right? And it had to be a separate area. Well, there was one library that was literally too small to have an adults only section. And so the entire library is now an adults only library.
Yeah. Yeah. This story has been big in library world. Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, so I'm sure very few people were watching the, nuances of library legislation in the Idaho State House. And now some kids after school program, either they're going to have to get some kind of waivers or it may go away because people either weren't paying attention, or the people who were paying attention were the people who had very different interests than the folks using that library.
Yeah, absolutely. Similar with some of the books that were banned here in Florida. They traced it back to a couple of people being the key complainants.
Yep.
A few individuals were the ones complaining about everything.
Yeah. And on a positive front, Florida did pass another law saying that you have to be in the district if you're going to complain. So small steps, but that's how things get done.
Absolutely. It is oftentimes how things get done.
Yeah. So now I do want to ask my technology question about if you had your dream piece of equipment, what would it be and how could you use it? Time machines? Well, let's try and obey physics at least.
We don't know that it wouldn't work with physics yet. We just maybe don't have the science for it.
I don't think we can go backwards. I think we can only go forwards.
Well, it's still a time machine.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's a tough one.
I like time machines because, one of the criticisms we get in the social sciences is that because we're not the hard sciences, we can't create some sort of laboratory environment, or we don't have alternate histories. But with time machines, perhaps those sorts of experiments would be possible, but that sounds a little far-fetched.
Setting up a biosphere and closing people in.
There's a lot of ethical concerns associated with that.
I don't know. Something that does cold fusion, maybe.
Okay.
Something it would have to be something related to climate and cleaner, more renewable energy sources that don't destroy the planet or require extensive mining that steals even more land from Native Americans and or burns forests and puts more pollution in the air. So some sort of safer, renewable, easy to scale up energy source that might mitigate the crisis we're in when it comes to the climate would have to be it. But I'm not enough of a scientist to even know what to ask for there.
Yeah, and something that cleans the oceans and the air, right? Like
Mm.
anything that could mitigate the damage we've done as the most invasive species.
And I think, see, we've all come right back to the idea of everything politics. Everything is involved in politics here.
It really is.
So my final question for you both is, tell me what, on your opinion, what do you think the rest of the world's opinion is of what you do? And what's that common misconception that you'd like to take a quick stab at fixing?
I'll let you go first, Angela, because mine's going to be grim.
That's too bad. Well, I think, as a professor, you always see these memes like what your parents think, what your students think, what the rest of the world thinks. A lot of people, I think, assume that a majority of my time is spent in the classroom, probably. And that's just not the case. Most of my time is spent doing research, planning events, coordinating things, running our honors program, writing, editing, publishing, thinking about stuff, attending meetings, all those sorts of other activities that we engage in, lots of service, peer review, tenure review. So I think that the first misconception is more about the process of being a professor, and that we do all of these other things. And so just because we're not in the classroom doesn't mean we're not working. And then the other thing is when it comes to human rights and politics, when people hear I do political science or find out I teach human rights, they always say, well, do you teach both sides? And I have to say, you mean that human rights don't exist? Explain that to me, please. And they ask a lot of other questions, and so I think helping people understand that it's the science of understanding voting behavior, why presidents make the wonky decisions they make, why civil wars don't end when we all know they should, like these sorts of questions, and then maybe some predictions that could help us make a better future are the kinds of things that political science is really focused on, and not really, being a talking head. We have talking heads. That's not what professors are. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about that.
And unfortunately, for my self-esteem, there's a lot of polling to tell me exactly what the vast majority of Americans think of journalists, and it is not good. We are not held in very high regard. Many people find us untrustworthy. I think especially being a journalist based in Washington, D.C., there's definitely a sense that we are out of touch and disconnected from the realities of people's day-to-day lived experiences. One of the more humbling things that has happened since I started doing guest hosting on C-SPAN for Washington Journal, which is this call-in show where people can call in from all over the country to share their political opinions, is just to hear how widespread the mis and disinformation is and how deeply entrenched some of these narratives are. And I think that for a lot of people, journalists fit into the categories of either celebrities, extremely biased talking heads, or robots. And there are celebrity journalists, there are extremely biased talking heads, but none of us are robots. And this debate over journalistic objectivity, which I don't think is real, and I don't think it ever was, but that's a topic for another day. I think that the most valuable thing and the only thing that's going to save my job from artificial intelligence is my humanity and my empathy. And the fact that I can relate to lived experiences, and I do have a moral sense of right and wrong. And I think that it's very difficult for a lot of folks to appreciate that I can be fair without being biased. And bias and fairness are something different. I don't have to give equal weight to two sides of an issue, or three, because there's rarely only two sides, to be fair. I don't have to say that, there is an equal argument to what's going on when a civilian refugee camp in Gaza is struck in an attack. And I don't have to give a both sides to that. That's a bad thing. You can also say it's a bad thing that was initially triggered because of someone else doing a bad thing. And you can be fair and knowing that somebody's going to call you biased. And I think for a long time, journalists were so scared of being called bias that we created a lot of false equivalencies. And that's been very damaging. And I think our reputation rightfully took a hit for it. But what I really worry about is how fragmented audiences are. And lots of people like to say, oh, remember back in the good old days of journalism where we all got our news from just a couple of sources and there was a universal understanding of truth. And sure, when there were 5 networks controlled exclusively by wealthy white men who gave that was the lens of truth of America. So I'm glad we have more perspectives. I'm glad we have more conservative voices on air. I'm glad we have voices from all over the country. I'm glad we have more women. We have more underrepresented groups. We have more queer folks. That's great. But that fragmentation has come at a cost of people not knowing where to go to get the truth. And I don't think we've found a good solution for that yet.
Information literacy. We offer classes about that at the library, folks.
It's kind of fascinating, to have been born in 1980 and see this change. We weren't allowed to have, email in high school because they were still scared of the internet at that time. And so to see this change and how our students now have so much information but don't know how to use it, it's fascinating. But I wanted to say, Kimberly, I think your point about empathy is such a good one because when I come back to my research and my teaching, everything always comes back to empathy and us just having that with each other. We learn so much, we grow so much. And like you said, you don't have to agree. But I believe that all opinions should be shared so that people have the opportunity. And if we're not repressing things, then folks are less likely to feel defensive about it, right? They're going to feel more comfortable and vulnerable.
We're going to leave it on that popular, hopeful note there for you. Thank you both very much for being here. Both of our guests' contact stuff is in the chat to go follow up and watch some of the shows. Getting lots of good, nice little comments in the show notes for everybody. I want to throw up our final slide here. If there's a topic you'd like us to see covered one of these months, reach out. creationstation@broward.org. We'll see everybody next week.